And welcome everybody. It's 5 o'clock on Monday with our live class. I was able to get back early and I'm really happy about that. I was at the Houston Wine and Food, or the Woodlands Wine and Food Week in Northwest Houston. And getting more and more appreciation for living in Bend, Oregon. All right, so we're going to continue our conversation, and also with the understanding people are still, getting into the different applications and getting their footing. Any pressing questions or issues or anything anybody has before we kind of launch into the program?
Can I ask you a question? I signed up, I believe yesterday or on Sunday. No, yeah, yesterday was Sunday. Did I miss a webinar?
No, webinars are noon on Wednesday and 5 p.m. on Monday, all Pacific Daylight Time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So unless I did something, and Mike Santos is here in spirit. How are you doing, buddy?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'll see if I can get my video working.
All right. And we were just sort of covering any questions and issues around getting into websites or any of that kind of stuff, if you've got anything. All right. So let me go ahead and transition over to screen share. And I'll just assume everybody's in good shape. And open this up. Many, many years ago when I was young, I started to wonder why we overcomplicate wine so much. Part of it is the idea that the romance and the seeming value of mystique and so forth. But on the opposite end of that is overcomplication, overcomplication, complication. I think I just invented a new word. And really making it really hard to understand simple kind of concepts. So one of the things I started doing in my wine courses is asking if anybody had ever grown a tomato. And then making the comparison how growing grapes is so similar to growing tomatoes. Not that it's this magical, mystical kind of thing, but there's an awful lot that you can say, oh, where are you going to grow the tomato? And anybody a tomato grower here?
Oh, yeah.
All right. And you've got Burpee's seed catalog, which back in the 80s was over 275 varieties of tomatoes. And now you've got all these heirloom varieties and everything else. If you know about a dozen or let's say at the high end, 24 grape varieties, you're doing pretty good, right? 275 or 500 grape or tomato varieties, my gosh. But the thing that characterizes each tomato variety is when does it bud and when does it ripen? How suitable is it for humid conditions? What's the ripening time frame? How many days from actual flowering to ripening? And so that people who are in tomatoes, you'll go down, you can talk to somebody in a store about getting the vines. You can plant them from seed. and grapes are really no different from that. Connie, what varieties do you grow typically?
Heirloom tomatoes we've grown. I don't even know. Big fat red tomatoes.
Big fat red beefsteak tomatoes.
Yeah, beefsteak
early
tomatoes.
girls.
Roma tomatoes.
Romas and whatever. And the other thing is that suitability for the end product of a tomato is also really important on a lot of both the physical characteristics of the tomato itself and the chemical composition, the flavor and aromas and so on. Roma tomatoes are durable. They actually are a dry variety. They're not very juicy in comparison to, say, a beefsteak tomato. So there are tomatoes that are much more if you will, compact. They have less water. They're better suited to certain purposes like tomato sauce and that kind of stuff. Where the ones that you might want for just, slicing and a little drizzle of vinaigrettes and salt and pepper, or even just salt, are going to be maybe those big, really juicy, watery ones that if you use for a sauce, it's got so much water there's not a lot of flavor. So you got to match the variety to the place you're going to grow it, and then you also have to understand what's the end product that I'm growing here. Then you've got to determine a trellising system. It's not good to just plant the vine or the seed and leave it laying on the ground. And you can get the little wire basket kind of things. You can grow them in all sorts of vertical systems. You can actually trellis and train them, or you can take a chicken wire or something to create a vine system. During the growing season, an awful lot of things that can attack a tomato vine are the very same things that can attack a grapevine. The pests and birds and mildew or mold and rot. If your growing season, your tomato vintage season isn't correct, you won't get the intended chemical composition and ripeness and things that you're trying to acquire, and so forth. So one of the things I just really find helpful for me is and especially when we're talking the business, is see what other products are similar to wine, and not this sort of mystique and enthusiastic interest in the product that it's so totally different, it's not like anything else. Okay. When I was a chef also, there is a practice. There are grape cellars, and there was actually a famous grape, or a famous incidence of this years ago. The guy actually went to jail for this. He would fill up his grape gondolas with whatever crap he could find of, let's say, red grapes, and then on the top he would put Cabernet Sauvignon or Zinfandel. And when I was a chef, you were always trained when the tomatoes are coming in the back door, you open the box, you take a look to see the size and the ripeness, and then you always look at the other layers. And this is why you'll also see core samplers at wineries. They'll actually have either a simple tool or a mechanized thing to go down into the center and down to the bottom of a gondola of grapes to ensure it's what you ordered. So we tend to learn about grapes and that some are bigger bunches and more prolific yields and so on, but very infrequently does anybody make the correlation, hey, it's a business. What does the size of the bunch, the yield, and the juice ratio have to do with the bottom line and the profitability of the business, the sustainability of the business. Okay. Any questions about that? The business of grapes, as every section, and in these more detailed slides, I'll send the PDF as usual. But think of all the related businesses to a vineyard as well. Real estate. My wife's a real estate agent and broker, and we worked many transactions. You've got banks, investors, legal, all in on and on and on. So also, while we're kind of focusing on the business of grapes and throughout for the rest of your life, think of all the other businesses and the equipment and all the things that you have to do. And when it comes to insurance, you can buy crop insurance. You can, there are lots of things you can do as a grower to protect your interests. And if you're growing and making the wine sort of the estate model, you also have to understand that it's very likely, and it's generally the best practice is to keep your vineyard as a separate business entity from the winery. And that way you can even balance things out as sort of, you're selling the grapes to yourself, but sometimes you might want to lose money in the vineyard. There might be a tax advantage to that. Sometimes you want to make more money in the vineyard and lose, so you can actually adjust the price that you sell the grapes to yourself for. But it should be a transaction point no matter what the model. The difference between truth and fertilizer. So, fertilizer is my semi-polite way of saying BS. I was lucky enough to grab this screenshot off of a video that was posted after the, was it 2011 that we had the big earthquake in Napa? And somebody came up with this picture, and this was on TV. And the earthquake was so hard, look, it knocked all the grapes off the vines. Well, this is crop thinning. If the grapes were knocked off the ground, I think they would have fallen down. But it is just so many wine education programs, so many wine enthusiasts have such a passionate attachment to the stories and the myths and so on that it's really hard to tell sometimes between the truth and the fertilizer. There's a lot of stock put into the struggling vines, and there are people who put crystals in the vineyards, and people who play music for the grapes and have ducks or goats that are out there eating the grass and fertilizing and whatever. Going back to the yield per acre, people want to think the consumer, the story seems better told if the vines are struggling and working hard for every bit of flavor. I was working with Cal Poly University on the early forms of the very workbooks that we're using today. And I was with Dr. Keith Patterson, who was the vine plant physiology and viticulture expert at the university. Somebody was talking about, in the Napa Valley, if you get more than 2 tons per acre, your quality is crap, and you've really got to bring those yields down. And Dr. Patterson was involved in a great transaction in Rutherford, California, in one of the most preeminent historic vineyards in the Napa Valley. And they were farming 14 tons per acre. Now, just quick math. 2 tons at current price of $8,000 a ton for Napa fruit. 14 tons at $8,000 a ton. Who's making money and who's not? And is there anything preventing you from getting the grapes from the 14 tons per acre site and saying it's 2 tons per acre? Is that controlled? Is there, some sort of yield police that are going to come raid you? So from this point forward, in all of your interests in wine, learn to be able to. There are issues around crop load and yield and so on, and that's basically, this was a vineyard that they were pulling grapes to sort of balance the vine back out. But consider, if you ever see something like that, that's money just laying on the ground. Was it warranted? How much did it cost? What did it do to improve the quality of that year's crop and the ongoing quality and reputation of the vineyard? And now you're kind of thinking like a business person. So in the business of grapes, in terms of critical thinking, one point of view is from the grower, who is looking at their bottom line for the business they're running. And then you've got the buyer, who has their requirements and what they're looking at. You've got conventional versus new thinking. There's also areas of the world, and certainly of France and Spain and Italy and Germany, where there's a lot of restrictions in what you can plant and how you're going to trellis and so forth. So what are the laws and the restrictions, if any? And then, of course, the difference between the enthusiast versus the business person, and then the stakeholders in the winery. So the critical thinking part, just because it's so important to me, there are lots of places you can go to learn more about critical thinking. For every Master of Wine student I've ever mentored or worked with in history, I always use bullet point number 2, when is wine a match for food, to demonstrate how we lose the ability to think critically when we start thinking in an area of expertise, okay? And then these are the kind of questions. This was the year that I passed the Master of Wine exam in 1990. This was the first compulsory question on the examination. How does a vineyard manager extract the best out of his site? Discuss with particular reference to vine spacing, trellising, and canopy control. Okay? And then another thing I'm going to hit on quickly is, oh wow, if I grow my own grapes, it'll be so much more efficient. I don't have the markup from the grower, so it's got to be less expensive, right? So let's take these one at a time. And the first one's a demonstration of how we narrow how we think when we think on a certain topic. And we'll get into this actual topic at the very end of the class. But this is from an actual Master of Wine question. When is wine a match for food? And you've got to write a compelling essay, create and defend a position. What's the most important word that begs to be defined in this little question?
When?
Nope. That's
No.
temporal.
Match.
Match. Match is the killer. All right. So I'm going to ask you guys, I want you to put aside wine. I want you to think openly. And I want you to define the word match. Who wants to go? Who wants to go?
When something complements another and brings out the best in it.
There you go. And this is typically where our brain goes. Now, I asked you to forget about wine, think openly. If you went up to somebody on the street and said, "What is a match?" what would they say?
Well, it depends if they're thinking of a lighter or if they're thinking of two things that are the same.
A pair.
So those are actually the most common definitions. And don't forget that 92% of all the people who take the Master of Wine exam and repeatedly fail it, they usually fail it for this and several other reasons. When is wine a match for food? Well, it depends on how you define the word match. A match can be something you use to light a candle or a cigarette, an incendiary device, right? A match could be identical to things. A match could be identical but opposite. So matching bookends that are actually opposite, or mittens that one goes on one hand. A match could be complementary. It could be two people who are a good match. A match could be a competition, like a boxing match or a tennis match, and so on and so forth. And the really cool thing is, a successful answer to this in the Master of Wine examination is taking every one of these definitions and then seeing if you could apply it in an appropriate way. That wine can be a match for food when wine adds that spark at the dinner table and kind of creates that glow around the table and brings people closer together. Wine is a match for food if you consider match being identical. Many people say wine is food, and then you've got to create a good rationale for why that is. Wine can be a match for food for a retail outlet or for a restaurant competing for consumer dollars and creating a competition ad nauseum. And you can actually come up with 7 really distinct definitions for match, write about how wine is a match for food. Your conclusion just repeats that, yes, wine is a match for food, and when wine is a match for food is dependent on how you've defined it, conclude, and go on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's critical thinking. It's actually being able to stop and stand back and say, what might I be missing? And then the second one, the reason this question was failed by the vast majority of people the year that I took it, is when they didn't look carefully enough at determining what extracting the best might mean. And at one extreme, the best is grapes destined for Romanée Conti or Petrus or Grange in Australia, or the finest of wines might be extracting the best. But extracting the best in many situations is simply getting as much frickin' money for the most commercial quality of stuff that you can pump out. It's called a sugar factory. And then taking some intermediary points to talk about how vine spacing, trellising, and canopy control might differ from the highest quality to the highest return on investment end of things. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, critical thinking there's advantages and disadvantages of growing your own grapes. And more people finding that the disadvantages far outweigh the advantages, because you've got years you might add on to getting things started if you're going to start from the ground up, and finding the site and planning it, and a couple if not several years before you even plant, and then several more years until you start to get a crop. And then if you're making the wine, you could be 10 years into your project and you haven't even produced a bottle of wine. The other thing is that it's a huge amount of time and distraction. Who's going to run it? Who's going to farm it? Who's going to do the work out there? the third thing is management companies that are farming large tracts of vineyards and managing maybe a lot of different vineyards. It really cuts the capital costs for equipment and machinery and those kind of things. And then finally, is if you're making grapes only from that vineyard and something happens in that vineyard, you could lose a whole year of any return. And it disrupts your supply chain to restaurants and distributors who, if you build a good reputation and then all of a sudden you're out of wine. And this is being seen in Chablis with the heavy frosts that they had last year, and they had to do anything possible to salvage crops, and there were devastating losses. It could be fire, it could be smoke taint, it could be bad weather, and so forth. And so again, some careful business considerations and critical thinking needs to go into, how am I going to source my grapes? How am I going to ensure ongoing supply? How am I going to mitigate my risks? And how am I going to increase my profits? Okay. All right. So what determines costs and what contributes to profitability? Well, value of the grapes is highly, highly dependent on origin and location. You've got the cost of the real estate. You've got how much is the site to prepare. It's really easy to plant on low, flat, level ground, on steep hillsides and so forth. It really becomes a huge cost consideration, and especially the site preparation and that kind of location now, environmental impact reports and erosion control and permits and restrictions on different ways. So much of what's planted around the world could never be developed as new vineyard. It has to be grandfathered in because they're not allowing people to just go up into the hillsides, tear into it, plant a vineyard, and move forward. Then you've got all your hardware and trellising. One of the things in terms of profitability and actual value of the crop is the quality history of either the origin or even the specific location. We're going to show you that Napa Valley Cabernet can sell for somewhere around $1,000 a ton, and I haven't even looked at it. The 2018 crop crush report. We're going to look at it in a minute, and I'm going to send you all there to go peruse it. But what do you think the highest price per ton at a commercial level is paid for Napa Valley Cabernet? Anybody got a guess?
About $75,000 a ton.
Yeah, I think it's about 50,000. And yeah. And
I believe there was a sale for 75,000 last year.
What's that?
I believe there was a sale for 75,000 last year. You probably know whose it is.
Oh, I know whose it is. And what we're going to do is, I'll go ahead and introduce it now. You guys, I'm going to give you a link to the 2018 crush report, and you'll be able to click on this and open it up. Oops, I already had it open. Let me close that. And this is 164 pages of every legal grape transaction in the state of California. There are other states and different countries and similar things to that, but nothing I know of in the world that's anywhere near this comprehensive. We're going to need to go to area 4, and let me see if I can guess where it's going to be here. All right. District 4. God dang, I'm getting good at this. All right. Don't look at the page a second because it'll give you a headache. So this is 2017's legal recording and documentation of every grape transaction in the state of California. And it gives you the price per ton. It gives you certain code numbers for that if you're really interested, you go look up, and then it'll give you how many tons was in the transaction. And we're going to go down to, let's see, we want to find Cabernet Sauvignon, and it separates white grapes and red grapes. And so somebody bought 2.4 ton. Oh, we got a new low. Last year, the lowest price was $1,000. And this year it's 150 bucks. Not much quantity, but you can see somebody got 181.9 tons for 500 bucks a ton, which actually might have been an internal transfer, like we were saying, of somebody who owns their own vineyard, and they're just recording the sale to themselves. And
So that would be in here as well?
What's that?
That would be in here as well. If they're selling to themselves, you wouldn't be able to tell.
Nope. You're going to have to use some deductive reasoning. It could have. Now, the other thing is you can start to go into the want ads in winebusiness.com or Wine Industry Network and start to see how many people have fruit available that's not under contract, and people start to panic. So part of the game is you can play the spot market, and there's a lot of risk in it, to see right before harvest who's willing to come down and say, hey, you know, I've got 182 tons potentially, you know, to get it off my hands. You know, otherwise you're just going to be stuck with it rotting on the vine. Now I'm going to go through, there's going to be a lot of this, so again, don't look too closely, and let's go see what the highest price, and look at all these transactions. Boom, 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 boom. We're up to 13,000. So 18 tons at 50,000 was the highest.
There we go.
Yep. Now it'll also give you an average weighted base at the end of each category. And you can see if you were growing Cabernet Sauvignon, it was nearly average of 8,000 bucks a ton. If you were growing Carignan, it's just below it. And then they'll have Carmenere and Charbonneau and all these. It is also really fun to go and, holy moly, what is that grape variety? You know, or, you know, who the hell's buying this and making something out of it? So it's kind of cool. So there's two things going on in the business of grape. The demand of the wineries has become so great to concentrate the flavors, achieve these really, really high ripeness levels, and this is increasing the risk for the grower, whether it's yourself or whether it's somebody you're buying for. Then the other thing is the winemakers are going in and saying, oh, we want you to drop 10% of the fruit on the ground so that we can get more concentration to what's left. And so, and if you're the grower, you say, well, who's eating that cost? I'm not throwing my god dang fruit on the ground, you moron. Oh, and besides that, we want you to actually allow the grape to start to dehydrate to a certain point. So let me get this straight. You want me to lower my yield to begin with. You want me to go through and do green harvesting. You want me to do all this leaf blowing and all this kind of stuff that's expensive. And then you want me to go back through and drop more fruit on the ground. And then you want me to watch the water evaporate. And so what's happening more and more in grape contracts is a grower contracting with the winer says, I'm going to fundamentally give you all the fruit that comes off of this acre for the equivalent of 5 tons at $8,000 a ton. If you want whatever you want me to do to the grapes, if you want me to green harvest, if you want me to crop thin, if you want me to take these risks, it's all on you, baby. You get what comes off, and if it's 1 ton, then you're paying the equivalent. You're paying that equivalent price for that acre. I'm not going to take all that risk. I'm not going to do all those things for nothing. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So it's a business that's changing dramatically. These prices, you know which vineyard it is, Rich?
I would guess Beckstoffer.
Andy's a smart guy. Andy was a grape buyer for Allied Domecq back in the days of, Allied, I'm sorry. Who the hell was he? It was people who decades ago owned BV and Almaden and so forth. And he started to buy up vineyards when they came up or were distressed and whatever. To buy To Kalon vineyards from Beckstoffer, you have to determine what your selling price per bottle for the wine would be, per bottle, times 175 equals your price per ton for his fruit. And so you can back that out and figure out what at that 50,000 a ton, what that did, what the cost of that wine was. Does that make sense? Okay. There's so much data in here, and there's trends, and there's all this kind of stuff. So you guys are going to get to play with this, and I'll send the link so you can go in and take a look at it. Oh. The other thing is that on the Napa Valley Wine Academy site, when you go down to the bottom of this page, remember at the bottom of the lessons are topics. One of the topics, I would consider this not optional. I want everybody to go in and read it. You go to the bottom of our current class page, and at the bottom topics, I can actually, let me go ahead and show you how that works. All right, so this is our main course page we went over Wednesday. There are 4 topics. And then I want everybody to do the Grape Price Research Project. It's explained how much does it cost to plant and maintain. And then click on the grape purchase and contract. And then this is a link that'll open up the following PDF. And this is by James Terry and in a law firm. And this is unbelievably good information at how a winery protects itself, number one, against as much as possible about fluctuations of market conditions and pricing, also mitigating risk from fire, smoke taint, pestilence, bad weather, those kind of things, while also, and this is the key thing that kind of holds anything in balance, if you're working with a grower and there's a problematic vintage or an issue, and let's say that you could get out of the contract and you abandon it, they might not let you back. You could lose that source. So there's also this mutual buyer-seller covenant, if you will, that, you know, don't stiff me, don't get that bad reputation, because news travels fast. But if you renege on this year's contract, you might lose it for the future. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So this is really good reading and brings forward a lot of the things that are in the consideration between the grower and the buyer. Okay? Now, the grape research project is going to be part of the cost of goods calculator. I'm going to start to go over that a little bit more, and then Wednesday we'll go over it more, and then Monday again. So it's just something to kind of be aware of. But one of the instructions is I want you, for your project that you're working on for cost of goods, I want you to call a winery and see if you can determine how much a ton they pay for grapes. And it's kind of nice to say, okay, we're doing a $25 red blend. I'm going to call a winery in Washington or in Virginia. Doesn't matter where you're going. If you want to play around with a rhubarb wine, which I think I've mentioned we've had people do before, they had to go find out what does it cost for a ton of rhubarb, and what's the conversion rate after you add the sugar and the other elements. How many cases do you get out of a ton of rhubarb, and what's the cost per ton, right? And so hopefully all or most of you will be posting that on the site. Okay. All right, let me go back to my presentation. All right, so grapes in the supply chain, just as if you're making a fancy tomato sauce for the market or whatever, you're going to be relying on your grape source. But there's also a sub supply chain within just the business of grapes. The identification of a site, negotiations for the real estate, the planning and the layout. So there's all these steps that need to be taken, contracts, finances, equipment, preparing the soil, the irrigation, the drainage, and so forth. And for anybody who's interested, there's a separate Wine Biz financial calculator that goes into incredible depth for all of the costs for starting and for maintaining and running a 15-year vineyard forecast. Do that on your own time, and if anybody wants to play that or is considering starting a vineyard or wants to do this for their studies, let me know. We might do a little separate kind of thing, and I'll show you where that is in a minute, right? And the supply chain of grapes gets you from the point that you've got a piece of land and you've got everything to do to have the fruit, and the fruit then taken ownership or transferred to the ownership of the producer. That makes sense? So in the presentation that I'll send you, and you can do any kind of research you want, Washington grape prices, by variety, over time. And you can see sometimes, like in 2016, for white varieties, Semillon was for some reason, not a lot of acreage, not a lot of production, but the highest value of any white grape in 2016. You can also start to get a sense of why, if you're growing Charbonneau in the Napa Valley, what's your return on investment when the highest price paid is $3,500 a ton, and the average price for Cabernet is nearly twice that, or is over twice that, et cetera, et cetera. So also, as you're seeing people who are growing obscure varieties and taking these risks and doing different things, to have a Riesling from the Napa Valley today is kind of a like, what are you, crazy? How are you ever going to get a return on your investment in the vineyard, let alone the price you need for that bottle of wine in the marketplace, and further down the supply chain? Grapes, like anything else, are you know, more often than not, the price is negotiable. You'll set up a contract, but even within that contract, there may be room for negotiation. A lot of people don't understand that in a bad vintage, like 2011, there was a lot of rot and mildew and so on in California, and grape prices actually went up because the demand was so high. And so even though it was one of the generally lowest quality vintages in a long, long time, it didn't mean the grapes were cheaper. So then how do you work that into your business plan? Now you've got a less than stellar vintage that's getting bad press, and your actual cost of raw materials is greater. So this kind of goes over a lot of the grape pricing issues and the new models that I mentioned too. So this, and ending with the one for Beckstoffer, if Tor Kenward's selling Tor for $200 a bottle, he's paying $3,500 a ton. Now that may have changed also. This has been the model for years. Another thing is, if you've got a better than average Napa vineyard, the way your contract might read is, I'll give you a contract for X quantity of fruit, and the pricing model is going to be last year's average plus or minus XX%. So my wife was doing she sold a vineyard up on Diamond Mountain, and their standard contract, because it was mountain fruit, had a really great reputation and so on, and their grape price was just simply set as the previous year's crush report average times 30%. So they just added a premium to it. If you've got a less than stellar reputation or placement in the Napa Valley, you might have your contracted value last year's average minus 10% or 30% or something like that. Does that make sense? All right. So all sorts of information out there, and if you're in this class to do business or start a winery or learn the fundamentals in New Zealand or France or whatever, sometimes it's really, really hard to find out what the actual pricing is. I think there's a new service in New Zealand that's actually giving a pretty thorough grape price report now, and so on. So if anybody's looking for other information like this about grape prices, put it up on the discussion forum and let's see what we can dig up. Okay, and then general trends by color, acres by color, and you can see what's going on in Washington and the move to red wines, the different grape varieties and what's being planted, and you can see the huge bump in Cabernet Sauvignon. Merlot's making a little bit of a comeback, white varieties, and so forth. So you can compare those, and then don't remember all these related businesses, all of which, everybody's got to market their products, their services, the technologies that are in the vineyard, and so on and so forth. Okay. So let me see. I mentioned last Wednesday that this was also a really critical decision. Do you sell the fruit, or do you contract to have the wine made and then sell the bulk wine? And that there's an inverse relationship between bulk wine prices and demand and grape prices and demand. And it's just absolutely an elegant inverse relationship. So more and more producers, or more and more growers, especially if they're more in that commodity basis, actually will go ahead and bite the bullet, have that extra cost of having the wine made, but then can have an average 15% greater return on investment by selling the bulk wine versus the grapes, right?
It
And
doesn't
then
seem to
also
be
with-
the case this year.
What's that?
That doesn't seem to be the case this year.
Things are a-changing out there, aren't they?
All right, the one thing to remember about anything that's grown is eventually it will be overproduced.
Yeah,
And that goes for anything agriculture in the state of California or in the country. I've spent 30 years in the produce business, and that's what they're doing in the wine industry right now, is overproducing.
yeah. And you see it also in almonds and tomatoes and just about everything else, you know, trying to figure it out all, you know, it's an agricultural pursuit. You're in the farming business. Okay? And then just a little recap of all that. Then next I want to, so any questions about that lingering? Are we all good? All right. The cost of goods workbook. Hopefully everybody's at least opened up and played and gone around this. Several of you have already created and saved the workbook. Remember that when you save it, you bookmark it. It'll create a new URL, and that's how you've got to use the bookmark or somehow save the URL up at the top here to get back to your workbooks. If you lose your work and can't figure it out, just let me know. I can find it for you and send you the URL. So no panicking, okay? The key thing I want you to toggle around and play with is that in the different tabs up here is the grape costs. And so start taking a look at the crush report, those kind of things. And if you're making a $25 red blend, don't forget this is already completely filled out. But let's say that you were playing the spot market, and let's say that we were just doing this 50-50 Cab and Merlot blend. And let's say all of a sudden you could get Napa fruit for $500 a ton. Here's our gross margin here. We're making 100,000 bucks. I'm going to plug in 500 bucks. Napa fruit. Boom. We just are making 42% more gross margin than previously based on being able to go in and reduce the cost of our fruit that much. Now that's a pretty wild scenario, but there are people who play the spot market, and Rich will tell you, you know, with any produce, it's, you know, there's contracts and there's, you know, the safety and so forth of your supply. And then there's risk taking and playing a different market. And it gets really, really dicey if you need a certain amount at a certain quality. Can you take the risk to wait and see if the prices are going to come down or not? So go in and play with this, or look up different varieties in different area of California and so forth. And then the other thing is that over on the production tab, it's going to tell you how many tons you need, what's your total cost. But this is a critical number here. How hard are you going to squeeze those bad boys? The conversion rate of how many cases you get from a ton of grapes can be as low as 30 or fewer cases per ton for ice wine. An awful lot of high-end producers will never exceed 50 cases per ton. And if you wanted to squeeze the bejesus out of it and maybe have the equipment to be able to do so and still maintain pretty good quality, as you squeeze more out per ton, you're going to see our gross margin go up. So if we were able to reduce our Cabernet Sauvignon price on the spot market and squeeze 6 more cases per ton out of the juice, we're making an additional 50% increase in our gross margin. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. So that's what we're going to kind of leave you guys with today. And then next Wednesday, we're going to start focusing more on production and barrel costs and a different sort of models for production as well. Are you going to build the winery, own and service all the equipment, do it, you know, on the state model? Are you going to get together with other people or buy into what's called an alternating proprietorship? Are you going to do none of it and just contract for somebody else to do it and be a client for a custom crush and those kind of things? Okay? So that is our segment on the business of grapes. And any final questions, comments? And don't forget, it's a business. It's a, and we've got Rich here, and Rich has a career in growing and in agriculture. Do the required work, which is for your project, which will be due a week from Wednesday, the cost of goods workbook. I don't care what your cost of goods workbook looks like. You can totally screw it up, but I want you to go in and noodle with the numbers and see, wow, what if I did this here? What would be the effect here? We used to have a really simplified barrel aging program, and we could show really quickly what the effect was of doing a stainless steel versus a barrel fermented, barrel aged Chardonnay. And it was just an eye popper, like, oh my God, if I cut the barrels out, I could have millions of dollars for marketing a no oak Chardonnay. And that's what's happening out there. So if you're out doing your homework, also start looking at grape prices, see if you can find a California AVA Cabernet, or do this with French wines, do this with whatever market, because I think we've got one of your classmates is in Russia. Karen, where are you located?
Canada. In
Canada. So play within your markets and whatever, and see what you can do, and take some pictures also. And if somebody's doing a red blend of sort of a weird combination, not classic Bordeaux varieties or Rhone varieties, and that they've got a very open and general source like the state of California, they're playing the market. They can do all sorts of things to acquire their grapes versus somebody who's doing a red blend from Stag's Leap District or from Paso Robles or whatever. So as you get more specific on the origin, you get more locked into your options and your availability of how you can play the business of grapes to the advantage of your bottom line in your own pocketbook. Okay? Anything else?
That's good.
There we go. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
It's really great having you on, and I think I mentioned my last class. I was half the classes I was alone because everybody was just watching the videos. So it's great to have you here and be able to look at you, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
All right,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.